The Lord be with you.
And also with you, Steve.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with unclean hands, that is, without ritually washing them. For the Pharisees and the Jewish people in general follow the tradition of their ancestors and never eat without washing their arms as far as the elbows. Moreover, they never eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe: the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and religious scholars asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples not respect the tradition of our ancestors, but eat their food with unclean hands?" Jesus said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you, you hypocrites, when he wrote, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You disregard the commandment of God and hold to the human tradition.'" Then Jesus called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and try to understand. Nothing that enters us from the outside can defile us, but the things that come out are what can defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The good news of salvation. Be doers of the word and not hearers only. I think in many ways, this phrase from the letter of St. James, our second reading this evening, sums up the message of all our readings. I think taken all together, our readings call us to maturity as Christians, to real, genuine, authentic discipleship. Because to be mature Christians means not just to keep rules and laws slavishly, but to get inside of them and see their meaning, and then put them into practice in our daily lives. The last several months, I've been thinking a lot about discipleship. And a few weeks ago, I was asked by friends of mine at the World Council of Churches to write a short article on discipleship. And as I thought about this, it was just like 1,000 words, it wasn't a lot. I got an idea about discipleship as discipleship has kind of 4 dimensions. Disciples, first of all, learn. And then they begin to imitate. And then they integrate. And finally, most importantly, they innovate. And I think this is what our readings tell us today, that we are called to be disciples, not only to hear the word, but especially to be doers of the word. So disciples begin by hearing the word. They begin as learners. That word disciple comes from the Latin word discere, which means simply to learn. And I think at the first stage of disciples, we kind of sit at Jesus' feet and we learn from him. And like our reading in Deuteronomy says, our first reading, we learn about the law. We learn about Jesus' commandments and his ideas. We recognize how wise all of these things are. In other words, we learn to love the tradition. Then we begin to be doers of the word. And we do this in kind of a hesitant fashion. We begin to imitate. We begin to imitate Jesus. It's like we stop sitting at his feet and put our feet in his sandals. And we learn to walk his walk. We try to do what we think he would do. We try to be kind and loving in our lives. We try to be on the side of the poor. We try to bring healing and consolation to those who are hurting. In the words of our second reading, we care for orphans and widows in their affliction and keep ourselves unstained from the world. Of course, as we do this, we keep on learning and we keep on hearing the word. But as we do this, Jesus' mindset becomes more and more our own. And we begin then to integrate. We begin to internalize the law, to internalize Jesus' message. And it's like our feet grow to be perfectly the size of his sandals. And our discipleship becomes not something that's outside of us. We're just kind of imitating what Jesus would do. But we realize that we're most ourselves when we imitate Jesus and what Jesus did. We begin to have, as St. Paul says, the mind of Christ, or we put on Christ. We move toward, I think, that interiority that I think Jesus hints at in the gospel. It's not what is outside, it's what's inside. Sometimes the inside is ugly, but we try to make it beautiful and conform ourselves to the mind of Christ. And then finally, and as I said before, most importantly, we innovate. And this is where we perfect our discipleship, where we become real doers of the word, and not only hearers of the word. A good number of years ago, I heard the great African-American philosopher Cornel West speak. And he was talking about what he talks to young African-American men about is, he says, in jazz, it sounds like the person up there is just so free and doing all this stuff and riffing around and, all this stuff. You don't realize the discipline that musician has to have in order, to riff, in order to innovate. Jazz is not something that's just free. You have to know the tradition. But ultimately, if you're going to play jazz, you have to improvise. You have to innovate. I remember also a number of years ago now, I was visiting the Art Institute, and it was an exhibit by the great Impressionist painter Edgar Degas. And I was listening to the headphones, and there was one point that he was quoted saying, we have to learn the old masters in painting so we can surpass them. And this is, I think, what we mean when we, as disciples, reach the stage of innovation. We meet new things in our world today, things that Jesus never would have thought of or imagined. But we meet them as disciples with his mind, and we innovate. Just think of the whole question today of gender identity, or of evolutionary theory, or of new medical practices, or new challenges in racial equality, or same-sex marriages, or the challenges of this pandemic, the challenges of climate change. If you asked Jesus back then, he wouldn't know what we're talking about. But we have to bring our discipleship to these issues. We have to bring our own learning and our own imitation and our own integration so that we can innovate in our world today. I think the real doer of the word is not the one who simply repeats it. The real disciple just doesn't know all the rules and just applies these rules to, the present. Our learning, our imitation, our integration gives us the wisdom and the creativity to respond to our world and to people today who need us with the mind of Christ. Now again, I think it's important that these are not like 4 stages we go through. They're kind of like a circle, that we're always learning and imitating and integrating. But the key thing, I think, in discipleship is to innovate, to riff, to improvise, to surpass the past by meeting the present. As disciples, we learn to love the law. We learn to love the tradition, but not to get bogged down with it. We finally become disciples, true followers of Christ, when we innovate. And then we are heralds, true heralds of the reign of God.